Welcome, Valerie.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming to St. James.
Thank you all for having me, and thank you for inviting me.
It's been fun. If you weren't here Friday, we had a great time. I am not going to read her bio to you because it's on page 15. We're going to dive right in this morning and have a great discussion about just war theory, tradition, ethics, right?
Yep.
Not just theory. I've prepared some questions and just kind of listen into our conversation. So I'm going to let you do a brief history. She kind of went over on Friday night, so okay,
Yep.
Let's go.
Okay, so the brief history, actually, Bill, if you were here, could do this better than me, but the early Christian church struggled with the question of what we should do as Christians in politics in general, serving as politicians, serving as judges, serving in the military, commanding militaries. So up until the time of the Emperor Augustine, the Christian church was pacifist. There's a lot of different reasons for that. Some of it's coming from the New Testament, the requirement to live quietly in the world, right, under the leadership of the Roman Empire. But some of it was a concern that involvement in any of those positions required you to be in the world in a way that was really uncomfortable at the time because of the pagan Roman Empire. So if you were to serve, you had to serve a pagan emperor who would demand that you participate in pagan activities as part of your job. But when the Roman Empire became an empire that was friendly to Christianity and adopted Christianity as a sort of state religion, then Christians had to ask another question. How do we be in the world when, right, we are capable of holding political power, capable of using political tools to accomplish justice in the world? So the tradition that emerged between the 4th century and the 13th century that we still use today in the just war tradition is to think about a series of questions, right? So is a war just? Does it have a just cause? Is it for self-defense or to right a wrong in the world? Is it aiming at justice? Is it fought for the right intent? So are those things that I'm saying are my cause, are they really what I'm fighting for? Is it fought with the end of peace? Am I aiming for peace as the end goal? A peace, by the way, not everything that is not fighting is peace. This is really important to think about, especially in the context of Ukraine. So it can be very easy to say, well, if war is terrible, which we know it is, that therefore, right, peace is inherently better. But there are pieces that are worse than war because they are more oppressive than war, right? There are pieces that are quiet because a genocide has already happened, right? And those who would have been defending themselves are already dead. That isn't really peace, right? So in the just war tradition, when we think about peace, we mean peace that comes with a kind of justice, right? So we have to fight with the aim of that kind of peace, not just to stop fighting, right? But to reach a point of justice where we can live together with our neighbors. Our fighting has to be proportionate. The way that we fight can't exceed the good that we're trying to achieve. So if you're fighting for something that's really urgent and really important, then the rules of war are more tolerant to the harm you can accomplish. Whereas if your war aim is something very, very narrow, then your ways of fighting have to be more narrow. There are also rules about fighting in war. And this is also useful for thinking about the justice of a cause, because I know the next question is, what do I think is just and unjust in the last 100 years? Which is a tough question, because what has a just cause and what is fought justly are two different things. So even if you have a just cause, it's possible that you can fight it in an unjust way by targeting civilians, by aiming your force at people who have nothing to do with the conflict, who pose no threat to you, by fighting in indiscriminate ways that don't try to discriminate between civilians and non-civilians, right? And by fighting in ways that make peace impossible in the end. So part of the right, just way of fighting from within the just war tradition is to think about how would you use force in a way that makes peace possible in the end? Not just victory, but actual peace, which requires this element of justice and to reach that end goal.
Got it. I'm going to plug your book. Okay. Real Ethics, A Just War. It's on sale at the usher's table. I would highly recommend this because you really dig deep into various faiths also, so the Hindu and Islam included in that. And I think what we don't realize is a lot of the ethics come from Augustine of Hippo in the 4th century and then Thomas Aquinas in the 16th century. It's a very kind of spiritual aspect to this whole theory and tradition. And when we go and talk about Iraq and Afghanistan, I thought you had a really great explanation Friday night that really stuck with a lot of people when you talked about England and America. Could you go into that a little bit? Because I would like to have them hear about that.
Sure. So a question that I hear circulating a lot of times from my students, I'm a university professor, is the argument that Russia has made for its war, one of several arguments, is the idea that Ukraine is somehow naturally part of Russia's sphere of influence, that maybe Russia and Ukraine are really one state, one people, that there's no difference between them. There's some really good history you can read to sort of unpack those claims, which are misleading and not in keeping with the actual reality of history or the current way in which Ukrainians think about themselves. So one really great history that you can look at is by a Harvard professor called Serhiy Plokhy. It's called Ukraine, the Gates of Europe. It really does a great job. But one of the ways of thinking about that claim, that if we both speak Russian, and a large percentage of Ukrainians do speak Russian in the eastern part of the country, especially, but also in the south, even in Kyiv, right? Russian is a very commonly spoken language. So the Russian government's argument is, well, if everyone speaks Russian, then they're Russian, right? But if we think about the logic of that claim, right, then if the sort of heart and soul of the English language is England, the land of Shakespeare, and if our literature's root, right, and even the root of our own faith tradition as Episcopals is in England, in the way that the Russian state says that the root of Orthodoxy is in Kyiv, then that suggests, logically, that London should belong to us, because we need to stay together, right, as one people, because we share a common language, a common faith tradition, right, this common and integrated history, right? And if that makes you giggle, which I hope it does, then, right, you should think about, well, how could someone in the 22nd, I keep wanting to put this in the 22nd century. I'm done with the 21st century. It has not worked out very well, right? So, can you imagine in the 21st century making the argument that just because someone speaks like me and worships like me, that they must want to naturally be part, right? And we know that that isn't the case, right? Because we see Ukrainians, Russian-speaking Ukrainians, as well as Ukrainian-speaking Ukrainians. We see Christians and Jews and Muslims, right, in Ukraine, all standing up against the Russian aggression. So that argument kind of falls apart, but you can see logically why it might be appealing to Russians in the way that, at a certain level, you could see it appealing to think about, right, London as a natural extension, right, of America's place in the world.
Great, thank you. So Valerie, you're an Episcopalian, so it was very easy to talk to her about this service. So before we get into your personal spirituality and how you have to deal with this, and then you have students and your college, I want to touch on the Patriarch of Russia, the Pope. There was an article in the Wall Street Journal, I believe on the 4th of May, that said the Pope isn't calling this, he's not even mentioning just war. And then he kind of a week or two later blasts the Patriarch of Russia. So you had a really great kind of explanation for that too, why the religious camp is kind of remaining pretty quiet. That drives me a little crazy, but...
So it's awkward, right, to criticize the Pope, but I'm going to, because I think that what is probably affecting the Pope is something that affects many of us, which is, we know war is terrible. And I had a certain discomfort with this question of, what wars have been just and unjust in the last 100 years, because in a certain sense, a war can be for a just cause. It can be necessary and important. And it can also, even if fought in the most just way possible, involve injustices. It will involve injustices, because war is messy. So we've heard a lot from the Pope about how war is wrong, the war should stop, the violence should stop. And on a certain surface level, that's true. But if you think about what would have to be true in order for the war to stop right now, if you don't direct that question of you have to stop fighting to anyone in particular, if you don't direct it at the Kremlin in particular, then what you're kind of saying is, well, Ukraine, you should just stop. Just, let it be, right? And I think that's ethically very problematic. From within the just war tradition, the idea that you could set aside claims of justice for the sake of peace feels to me to be the wrong answer ethically. The Pope and the Catholic Church have been moving for the last 30 years in particular, but really since the end of World War II, in the direction of pacifism and maybe something that's like the just peace tradition in Protestantism. And from that point of view, the Pope is kind of between a rock and a hard place. He's a diplomat as well as a faith leader. So if he describes this as a war where there's justice on one side and not on the other, he risks inflaming the conflict by, this is to touch on Patriarch Kirill, the patriarch of the Moscow Patriarchate of the Orthodox Church, has said that this is a holy war. So if the Pope says this is a just war, then the way that that could be played in Kremlin propaganda, the way that that could be heard by Russian ears, could be worse for the conflict. So there's a political aspect, I'm sure, to what he's thinking about. But there's also this move that the church has been having towards pacifism, which on the one hand I think is important, right? As someone who really subscribes to just war thinking, I'm not a pacifist. But I think hearing critiques from pacifists and from people who care about just peace is important because they help us think about last resort. Have we tried everything else that could have been done to avoid having war? Have we framed our foreign policy in a way that leads towards justice and peace, right? Or do we reach to force as the first and most handy tool? I think those critiques are important, but I do think it's dangerous from the point of view of justice to say I'm going to value peace at all costs. Then, what do we mean by peace? If peace involves justice, then we sometimes have to fight for peace.
Right, and when we talked briefly, you kind of don't let pacifists off the hook too easily, which I thought was interesting. Can you explain that?
Yeah, so I really respect pacifism, but if you're going to be a pacifist, then I really, really, really want you to think about how you can fight for justice. So ethical pacifism is not passive. It's about nonviolent resistance. So nonviolent resistance can actually be quite dangerous. And actually, I think, and this is part of the reason, to be honest, why I can't be a pacifist, I'm not strong enough, right? Because what nonviolent resistance would require is, rather than fighting to defend myself, putting myself in a deliberately vulnerable position in order to transform the other person and how they're responding to a situation. So we've seen actually examples of this in Ukraine, where villagers have come out to stand in front of tanks, and they're unarmed because they're ordinary people like you, right? So they come out and they stand in front of the tank, and now the young man driving that tank has to make a choice. Am I going to run over civilians? Or am I going to stop? Am I going to turn around? That's an incredible amount of courage, right? And you sort of put the moral weight on the other person. Or other sort of examples that you might have heard about are in Palestine. Pacifists will stand in between the Israeli army that might be trying to take apart a Palestinian village or settlement and those Palestinian homes, right? And they're unarmed, but they're standing there. And because they are there, right, the forces that want to do unjust things have to really see what they're doing in a way that it wouldn't be the same, right? If you're driving a tank into a building, that's one level of moral commitment. If you're driving a tank, right, over a civilian volunteer who's obviously unarmed, who's not even a party to the conflict, that's a whole other level, right? So pacifism can be a good way of being a Christian in the world, but you have to think about, how do I then fight for justice within the constraints of nonviolence?
Right. So Friday night we had tabletop discussions because we felt it was very important because this has been a very visible war with technology, the smartphones. You're getting it live. You're getting every 24 hours a day, the film. the most incredible conflict we've ever seen, literally right before our eyes, and it's been many times so hard and gruesome, let's face it. So it was a very valuable time for the community to be able to share their feelings. And I'm just wondering, you didn't really get to share your feelings, so here you are. But as an Episcopalian, love our neighbor, you have to, you're probably speaking to military academies. How do you deal with that inner conflict?
So, something that I've learned from talking to people who've served in the military, especially over the last 20 years, is that regardless of how you feel about a particular conflict and whether you personally think it's just when you're fighting for it or not, you come home a different person, carrying moral injuries that will last with you. So the choice to use force and to support the use of force, right, is a very grave one. So you can't take it lightly. At the same time, I really do think there are things that are worth defending. And if they're worth defending, then the voices we should be hearing and asking, right, like, have we defended enough? Have we fought enough? Is this the moment to sue for peace? Is probably not my voice, right, as an American. We should be listening to what the people of Ukraine are asking for, right? And as long as they are thinking through what is just and asking, is this proportionate? Is the good I'm fighting for, the defense of this community where I'm building a common life, right? Is this common life worth defending? As long as their answer is, yes, it's still worth defending at this price, then I think we have an obligation out of love for Ukrainians to continue, right, to support them in the way that they ask to be supported. Because you should think about when you're loving someone, right, what is the thing they need, and they know best. I also think, and this is difficult and I struggle with it, knowing what I know from conversations with American and Australian and British service people, Russian recruits in particular, some of them are committing grievous war crimes, and they should be held accountable for that, and they should be punished. But that accountability needs to come through a legitimate legal process, so we need to be sure that rights of POWs are protected, even when we really don't think they deserve it, because we owe them that as human beings. We also, I think, need to remember that Russians killed in Ukraine also have families, just as Ukrainian soldiers dying on the front line have families, just as Ukrainian civilians who are being killed for no good reason have families. So somehow, right, standing up for justice means speaking for those who are oppressed, defending them, helping them defend themselves. But it also means not allowing our hearts to be hardened and not becoming bitter, which is much easier for us to say and do than it is for Ukrainians. So this is a moment where we can sort of show what can be done because we're in a safe place to do that. So to not judge those who aren't in a position where they can emotionally find the space to forgive, because forgiveness is a process. You don't do it on day one, right? Like right after a bully has hit you on the playground, you're not like, okay, I completely forgive you. Although I had a pacifist friend in junior high. She was Baha'i, and I really admired her for being able to do that. But that was not me, right? It takes time. But, right, we need to try to balance those things, right? So to love those who are being oppressed and to support them in fighting oppression, but also we have to love the oppressor. So Desmond Tutu talks a lot about this, and so his writings are really useful in thinking through how to do that. But remembering that, while you say those two things, right, love requires disciplining those who do injustice. So if you think about your children, those of you who have children, when they're growing up and they do something wrong, you don't say, well, I really love you, so I'm just going to ignore the fact, right, that you didn't come back when it was curfew, or that you hit your brother, right, because I love you, right? If your two children have been fighting and one has hit the other, it's not love to both of them to say, oh, that's fine. You have to discipline the one who's committed the wrong. So love doesn't involve not speaking up. It doesn't involve not fighting oppression. It involves loving the oppressor at the same time that you might be forced to use force against them.
So you have 4 kids.
Yes.
And we have some parents in here. How do you talk to your children about war? Because you have teenagers.
Yeah. So I have 2 teenagers, a preteen and a second grader. So for my kids, it's a little bit different than it might be for many of your children, because my family is Lithuanian, so we have been talking about politics in this region forever. Also, I'm a political scientist, so we talk about politics at the table. We talk about religion at the table. I grew up doing that. So and my kids were therefore, even before this happened, kind of aware of questions of justice and independence and sovereignty and what that means. So I've been really transparent with them. But in general, what I think is important to do is to think about the age of your child and what they need to know and what they're really asking you. So with teenagers, it's so important to just be really honest. When they have questions, or even if they don't, to bring up, what have you heard about Ukraine? What are your classmates saying? Have your teachers mentioned anything? Because you don't know necessarily what kinds of conversations are happening at school that you might want to sort of intervene with an ethical or Christian point of view and say, what have you thought about this, right? And if your teenagers come to you with questions you don't have the answers to, it's really, really important to be honest and say, you know what, I don't know. Let's find out how we can find a good answer to that, right? Let's look into what Ukrainian newspapers in English are saying. Let's read some Ukrainian history together. Let's find a good documentary. Let's talk to people in our community, right? Let's find an answer. I think teenagers, they know when you're making stuff up. And once you do that, they're never going to come talk to you again about that issue. Right? So if you don't know, just say you don't know, or the conversation will never happen again, right? With younger kids, it's important to think about what they're asking, answer specifically what they're asking, and if you're not quite sure why they're asking, then ask them. So my 8-year-old came back from school this past week, actually. And we've been talking about this all the time, so I thought the question was really, really strange. And he said, Mom, are Ukrainians Nazis? And I thought, why would he think that? So I should tell you, he's really into World War II. So he understands what Nazis are, right? Which not all 8-year-olds do. He has a very clear concept. And I thought, why is he asking this question? So first I told him the political science answer, which is no, Ukrainians are not Nazis. There are no far-right parties in Ukraine's parliament, right? We had a very political sciencey conversation about that, as one does when your mom is a political scientist. But then I said, why are you asking me this question? And he said that one of his classmates had heard this, right, and was talking about it at school. And I said, well, something you can do at school is say, well, I've read about this and my mom has talked to me about it, right, and here's what I think. You can push back against it. So in my mind, I know where, right, his classmate is getting that from, but I don't want to burden him with American domestic politics, right? So I leave that part aside. And I think that's important to do.
Last question, but it's more of a statement and what we're doing. I love the fact that you said we could do more. We can individually think of things we can do to help the situation in Ukraine. And you had mentioned you go and make pierogies at a local place with Ukrainian women, and you talk, and it's been very valuable. And Lydia, who read this morning in Ukrainian, we've been collecting goods, and in the bulletin is a QR code where our social media evangelist is here today. Alex here. She can show you how to use a QR code if you don't know how after the service. But I would just like to encourage people to continue in that support, or if you have another venue, to directly support. Someone had a really great idea Friday night when we bring things that we stick a note or a heart or something inside what we're sending to Ukraine that actually is sending love along with that. So with that, thank you for being here, and we appreciate you coming all the way from New York.
Thank you.
to be with us.
Thank you.